Great, you can hear me? Finals. Tipping is when customers pay voluntary gratuities to service workers. I propose tipping should be abolished. Instead, workers should receive reliable salaries or be bonused based on mandatory service charges. I'm here to debate whether this should be done based on the harms caused by the current system. I'm not here to argue how this is to be accomplished or if it can successfully be abolished. Tipping is bad for workers. Point one. A, it's cruel. Employees face harassment and abuse from customers who use tips as leverage against them. B, it's unfair. Employees are often punished for circumstances beyond their control, such as staffing issues, poor food, and malfunctioning equipment. C, it's arbitrary. People carry less cash now, resulting in missed tips. 9% carry no cash in 2014, and 50% carry less than $20, leading to less tips for drivers, tour guides, and the like. D, it's exploitive. Owners are incentivized to overstaff, resulting in less wages for workers. E, it's also exploitive. Employers can use tip credits to decrease a server's wages down to as low as $2.13 an hour. F, it's exploitive. Again, outright theft of tip money is common in the industry. G, it's arbitrary. Some customers don't know that they're supposed to tip or how much they should tip, so they tip poorly. H, it's unfair. Back of the house workers tend to rely on voluntary contributions from waiters. I, it's inconsistent. Tipping income is inconsistent and unreliable for the workers. J, it's arbitrary. Tipping values are often based on race, gender, clothing, and other factors rather than actual service. 2, tipping is bad for customers. A, it's racist. Servers racially profile customers based on real and perceived racial differences in tipping. More than 1/3 surveyed that said that they had done this. B, it's confusing. Many people don't know the proper amount to tip or exactly who should receive tips. C, there's fraud. Customers don't always get receipts for their tips, and it's easy for them to be defrauded by unscrupulous employees through bill padding. D, it's ineffective. Because tips are paid after service, most tips are based on a personal idea of the correct amount rather than exactly service, so it doesn't ensure service. E, it's counterproductive. Because tips vary only a little based on service, 1 to 5% according to studies, servers are incentivized to serve more people rather than to serve them better. 3, tipping is bad for employers. Reputation. Staff treat customers unevenly, leading to bad reviews, including charges of racism. B, it's obfuscating. Customers sending a message by giving a low tip may never come to a manager's attention because the employee hides it. 4, tipping is bad for the public. Corruption. Employees often don't report tips as income, thus dodging lawful taxes. Tipping puts employees at the mercy of customers who are being exploited by employees. Tipping annoys and confuses customers who don't really get better service, and tipping leads to illegal and abusive behaviors. Abolishing it works. The owner of the Linkery in San Francisco said the following: "In our second year, however, we tired of the tip system, and we eliminated tipping from our restaurant. We instead applied a straight 18% service charge to all dining-in checks and refused to accept any further payment. Our service improved, our revenues went up, and both our business and our employees made more money."
Okay, Siegfried, can you hear me? Awesome. Well, congratulations on making it to the finals, and thank you for your analysis. I want to, before I examine your arguments, offer a couple different points of my own. I want to offer 3 different points of analysis. The first thing is that tipping is culturally ingrained. Specifically in the United States, tipping has been a part of our culture for quite literally hundreds of years. So even if you attempt to abolish it, tipping won't just go away unless you choose to ban it, which I don't think you're doing, and I think that would be a poor idea for a number of reasons. Cultural tradition is difficult to just reverse overnight. It's not something you can do instantly. The second observation I want to make is that tipping incentivizes good performance, more specific performance. And this makes perfect sense. When the amount of money that you make from a tip is dictated by the level of service that you receive, you're more likely to do well and perform better for the people that you're serving. A study by Richard McKenzie, a senior fellow at the National Center for Policy Analysis, found in a study from actual employees in restaurants across the United States and multiple states that the quality of service that is put in directly correlates to higher tipping. It found that in the restaurant industry specifically, that the ability to tip created a salesman-like mentality in employees who then developed relationships and rapport with local returning customers that was incentivized by tipping. The study was done with thousands of employees in multiple states, and it proves that when you have a tipping system in place, which is essentially a meritocracy, it allows for increased performance because it allows for employees to make more money based on the performance that they actually have. The third argument that I want to make is that the existence of tips allows employees who work well and hard to make a lot more money than they would be if they made just a base salary. The same study that I quoted earlier found that on average, servers who receive tips made well over minimum wage, and that they wouldn't want to give up tips for even a double increase in minimum wage. So where the minimum wage was $15 in certain states, they said they wouldn't even give up their tips for a $30 minimum wage hourly rate. And because that was because they argued that the tips make them actually more money when they have increased service. Additionally, they argue that service would suffer significantly, at least on average, if you eliminated the tip system, which, as we already proved, incentivizes a good performance. A restaurant chain specifically who decided to abolish tipping as a part of a 10-month trial ran, it was a chain, they declared that their turnover rate for servers shot up to 70% due to employees making less money, and they lost business due to customers balking at the price increase, which was previously required. My stance in this debate round is not that tipping is bad or should be abolished, but that there are definitely things that we can do to reform it, and that it just shouldn't be straight out abolished. The first thing is that rather than outright ban tipping, we should pay a base hourly wage lower than the minimum wage and allow employees to make that up in tips. If, however, for whatever reason, whether people be racist, whether people are confused by the tips, or whether they just don't pay enough, the employees are guaranteed at least a minimum wage. This solves for all the problems that you present and also allows for them to have an incentive to perform better.
What you describe is actually the system that already exists. What employees are allowed to do is to, as their employees collect tips, they can reduce the stated wage of the employee down to $2.13 an hour. So yeah, if you were to say double or triple that $2.13 an hour, people would not be doing particularly well. They make most of their money on tips as it stands currently. The proposal, the alternate system that I'm proposing, is that we add a gratuity to the bill, a fixed gratuity. It eliminates all these behavioral problems that we see in tipping, but it still provides a percentage-based money to the employees in order to do their job. So they're still incentivized to do good service and to sell more product to the customers, but they don't have to rely on the whims of customers. They don't have to suffer sexual harassment. They don't have to worry about racially profiling people. Gets rid of all those problems. Now, your first point, tipping is culturally ingrained. That's fine. I don't care. I'm not here to argue how we're going to get rid of tipping or that in whether we can get rid of tipping. I'm arguing here to say we should do that. How we do that, that's up to us. How successful we're going to be, that's up to us. This is a values debate about whether it would be good or not good to have tipping, to get rid of it. And I say it should be abolished for all the reasons that I've pointed out. Let's go on. You say that it incentivizes good performance, and it does, but not very much. This is from The Economist in 2015. A study of 2000 found the difference in customer service ratings accounted for only 1 to 5% of a variation in the dining party's tips. That's not 1 to 5% on the tip, that's 1 to 5% of the tip. So yes, it does correlate to better service, but not very much. And unfortunately, it also correlates to a lot of other things. This is from The Atlantic in 2016. Research suggests that tipping is not very fair. Tips have been found to be based as much on a server's race or age as whether or not at the weather outside as according to the quality of service. So as you can see that tipping is not based on service. Studies suggest that tips are larger when diners present a good weather forecast, when the bill is presented on a tray embossed with a gold credit card insignia, when the waitress is blonde, or as found in France, when she's wearing a red top. It's an incredibly arbitrary system, and it doesn't ensure good service. You pay your tip after you got your service. You know, it's too late for you to influence what the waiter is going to do unless you're a repeat customer. And these days, that's relatively rare. So there are incentives for good tipping, but there's lots of incentives for other things. You can make more money. You say that service can make more money. That's not really true. It's not a very good wage on average. This is from the Wall Street Journal recently reported that nearly 15% of America's 2.4 million waitstaff live in poverty, compared to 7% of all workers. So while some elites make a fair amount of money, many of them don't, and they are poorer than workers who receive a normal wage. Extend many of my problems. We have racism, sexual discrimination. I'll read evidence on that later. I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so on your first point, I'll go ahead and address the racial profiling and the sexism. My first argument is that racial profiling and sexism will exist regardless of the system that you propose. So even if you abolished it, actually make people less racist or less sexist. Secondarily, this actually is a turn argument from my side, because the only way to solve racism and sexism is to expose it. By abolishing tipping and hypothetically concealing the people who are sexist and racist, you actually keep racism and sexism entrenched. So we should definitely have that exposed rather than just conceal it. The big argument that I want to make here, though, is this is really irrelevant because it's going to exist regardless of the system. You're not going to drastically solve race relations or cure sexism by abolishing tipping. You just haven't shown the link that how your plan will actually do that. Now, you make an argument for a fixed gratuity in your last speech. There's a double blind argument that I want to make here. First of all, a gratuity is technically a tip. Like some restaurants have on parties of 20 or more, you have a fixed gratuity, like a required 20% tip. That is not an actual price change. That actually is a tip. It's just a required tip. So either you are advocating for keeping tips in place, just making sure that they're static, or you're advocating for a price increase. And if you're going to advocate for a price increase, then there's going to be several disadvantages I'm going to run. The first disadvantage is that it's going to harm businesses and harm waiters, specifically in the instance that I cited earlier from the National Center for Policy Analysis, which you didn't address, by the way. They, in one restaurant chain that had over 2,800 employees, what they did was they got rid of tipping, and in order to compensate for the increased wages, they raised their prices by 20%, which is, I think, what you just proposed. And what they found in that entire chain, which is in a lot of different states, is they found a 70% turnover rate for waiters and servers because now they made less money on average. In addition to that, they found that a lot of the amount of customers that visited the restaurant dropped. And the amount of business that they received went down drastically. And that's because the price increase necessarily turns people away. So when you have to increase all of your prices by 20%, it decreases the willingness for people to actually go to the restaurant. The perception issue is a huge one there. Now, here's what my plan does that yours does not do. Now, your argument, you didn't really address my alternative. What you said was, well, that's already in the system, and whether it's in the system or not is irrelevant. Your side in the resolution is that we should abolish tipping. My solution is that you allow people to be compensated up to the minimum wage or whatever that wage is if they do not receive if they don't receive that minimum wage in tips. So this already solves for the lack of money that people are making, the racism and the sexism. Because if somebody's racist or sexist to them, or somebody's tipped well because they're confused, all of those problems you listed, they're going to be compensated because they're going to go up to minimum wage. Additionally, your fixed gratuity doesn't necessarily increase the amount of money that those people make because it's a cap on the salary. So I can actually access all of the benefits of just having a fixed gratuity by saying we're going to allow for the potential. We're going to guarantee this much, but allow for the potential to make more through tipping.
Let's address the definitional issue. Gratuities are not tips for the purposes of this debate. I defined up front that tipping is voluntary gratuities rather than mandated ones. So that's not really part of the argument. So we'll throw that out. Profiling and sexism will continue to exist. Yeah, of course. But what we're doing here is we're trying to protect the servers and the customers from these problems. What happens is Black and Latino people and other people statistically tip less. And servers know this, and so they discriminate against those customers, especially. So it results in, even whether you are a good tipper or not, racial profiling by the people who are doing the tipping, and racial profiling by the servers against the people who are doing the tipping, because people short the tippers. So it's a problem. If we just have a fixed number, that's not going to happen anymore. Everybody gets treated equally as servers and as customers. The problem with sexism is really sexual abuse by customers who are using the tip as a kind of hold over the customers in order to grope, fondle, sexually make suggestive attacks, that kind of thing against them. We should reduce that. Of course, we're not going to solve these problems in society. However, we're going to protect workers from that, because now they won't, their tip won't be held hostage by these people. So let's move on. You talked about the price increase hurting waiters, and there's a contradiction here. You said that, well, people are paying higher prices, yet somehow the waiters are making less money. So yeah, they're paying higher prices before tip, but not and after the gratuity. So if the gratuity level that is on there is too small, yeah, of course you're going to lose your waiters. However, if you increase it and you give them more money, they will do better. And I would contrary your piece of evidence against my piece of evidence where they've had success. Now, are some businesses going to have success with this and some maybe won't? That might be the case, but we have a whole raft of other issues and challenges: tax evasion, bad gaming behavior, abuse, and racism that we have to weigh against that. So some businesses will succeed and some won't. That's just the way things work. Let me read you a little bit about the sexism, the customer profiling. For instance, a recent survey of 1,000 restaurants across the United States found as early as many as 70% of servers perceived Black as low average tippers and 50% perceived as Hispanic as below average tippers. In contrast, a mere 2% of servers perceives white customers to be below average tippers. As a result, white customers are more likely to get better service in full service restaurants. From the Daily Mail in 2013, these beliefs led to 38.5% of the waiters surveyed, a large majority of those who are white, to admit that they adjusted the quality of their service based on the race of their customers. And 52.8% of those surveyed said that they had seen colleagues discriminate against African Americans. Let's talk about harassment. No, we don't have a lot of time. Over 1/3 of women reported being deliberately pinched by customers, and over 2/3 received pressure from dates from customers in their workplace. Tip workers experience higher rates of harassment than non-tip workers.
Okay, so let's actually look at your last argument. This is kind of interesting because earlier I made the claim that that tipping incentivizes good service, and you denied it, and you said, well, that's actually not true. But then later you come back and you say that empirically speaking, Black people and Latino people tip less, and therefore they get worse service, which actually is a turn argument from my side, because that proves my argument that when people tip more, they get better service. And so I'm going to link this right back into my case, the argument that you just made for me, and make the argument that when you have tips, you have an incentive for employees and for people who are going to be paid the tips to work harder and work better. You denied this argument originally, but you still haven't addressed this in your case by saying you haven't offered any analysis on how that's going to be resolved. Nor have you addressed the empiric, which supported this, about how there was a lot of turnover and about how statistically people worked. The servers, at least, argued that people didn't work as hard when the pay was just static and there weren't actually tips involved. So there's empirical evidence to support it. Your study supports the argument that when you have tipping in place, it incentivizes better work. When you remove the incentive by abolishing tipping, you now have worse work, which is obviously a bad thing. The other argument that I want to make on the racism and sexism argument is if you look at the two worlds that we have here. Okay, the amount that people are paid in both worlds is equally static. Okay, so in my world, the restaurant pays a base salary lower than minimum wage, and then tips, they're allowed to make tips that go beyond that. If, however, for some weird reason, they don't go beyond that, you have you kind of have the safety net of them being required to pay the minimum wage up. So in both our worlds, we have minimum wage is what is going to exist. However, in my world, you have an incentive for employees to work harder because they can make more money. And additionally, you have a higher cap on how much money can be made. Your world keeps employees down and makes sure that it puts a cap on how much money they can make. My world actually incentivizes them to work harder and allows them to make more money. Additionally, this cap that I've argued for in my alternative is one that perfectly solves for racism and sexism. If people are going to be racist or sexist in how they're going to be tipping, then it's not going to matter, because we're going to solve for that by guaranteeing that employees are paid a specific amount. Your argument and your argument for a fixed rate results in a price increase, which, as I talked about in my study, turned away the amount of customers and created a turnover when employees have the potential to make less money. So in your world, you can say we have a fixed price. In my world as well, we also have the same amount guaranteed to both employees, but we have a lot more benefits and protections as well.
Let's talk about your counter plan. Really what it's doing is it's setting kind of a floor on how much money you could lose, right? It's not really making you any more money than you otherwise would. It's just saying, well, look, if you got terrible tips, you're at least going to get this crummy minimum wage. Yay. That's not really that great. We want to guarantee people a reasonable income for the labor that they provide. We're still going to allow people to incentivize based on the gratuity and the work they do. If they do more work, if they serve more customers, if they help customers better, and they encourage people to order more items off the menu, they can make increased amount of money. So doing their job is still something that will reward them, because the gratuities are percentage based. It's just that they can't get shorted by people that don't understand tips or didn't bring their cash wallet or whatever of the other myriad reasons that waiters get stiffed all the time. We had I read a whole bunch of reasons and really haven't refuted most of those. So carry all those across. We can address some of them later. It doesn't solve for racism at all, because people are still giving tips. If people still want to make reasonable money, they're still held hostage. It doesn't stop people from racially profiling, because they want to get the maximum tips. So they're going to serve those customers that they think are going to give more money. Now let's bring up, you said that this is kind of a turn on my argument, but it's not at all, because it's not actually the people who are giving more money or the people who are giving less money are getting better or less service. It's the people that the waiters think, predicting in the future will or will not, based on their race, and based on stereotypes, will give tips or will not give tips. You give a black man come into the restaurant, he might be a huge tipper, but the waiter's going to see him and say, oh, another black guy, he's not going to pay me a very good tip, and they won't give him good service. And then he will give a low tip because he got bad service. So they just shorted themselves a bunch of money and treated a person with undue respect without considering them as an individual, because they're working on racial stereotypes. And your system does not fix that at all, nor is it a turn on my argument. The problem is based on expectation. I already read your, there is a correlation between service and tipping, but it's very small. And there's a correlation between the weather outside, and there's a correlation between what people wear, other silly things like that. A recent study found that attractive servers earned 1,261 more tips in a year than unattractive one. Worse, tipping is a vehicle for customers' prejudices to inflate and to pay a gender and race influence society. Servers are tipped less. A study in 2011 found that anything less than exceptional service, women's tips were smaller. It's not a fair system. You're making these people rely on the whims and fancies and ideas of people, and in return, they have bad behaviors to try and protect themselves from these whims and fancies. It's a terrible system. Let's just pay a reasonable amount. You say that people won't work as hard, but we don't tip our doctors, we don't tip our lawyers, we don't tip a lot of very important professionals in our society because it's a ridiculous way to do business. This is a way for the restaurant business to cheat people out of their money so the restaurants don't have to cover it and they make the customers cover it instead. It's a terrible system. We should get rid of it.
I disagree that it's a way for restaurants to cheat, quote unquote, customers and employees out of their money. We can make an argument, we can have that argument if you'd like, but I think we could both agree that if you automatically increase the amount of money that restaurants have to shell out to individuals on a regular basis, that's going to make the restaurant suffer. Either they're going to have to raise prices or they're going to have to fire employees. And that's not good for anyone in any situation. So this argument that like restaurants are just raking in the cash and they're just being super exploitative is, I think, a poor one. And you have to look at the disadvantages that will occur if you have a fixed gratuity of 20%. And we already saw what would happen. We already saw with the restaurant chain in multiple states that had several thousand employees. They had a 20% increase in price. They lost more customers than they ever had, and they had 70% spike in turnover rate because those employees were making a consistent wage, but that wage was less than what they were making previously based off of tips. Now, and here's the other argument that you failed to address in this debate round. Okay, we talked about ceilings and floors. You've talked about how we both have a safe floor. The problem is that you have your floor for how much money that employees can make is the exact same as their ceiling. Okay, so whether it's $7.25 an hour or $15 an hour, whatever the minimum wage is, or whatever the amount of income is, the base salary, for you, the floor is always the ceiling. So sure, the employees will be guaranteed X amount of money, but that's the same in both systems. However, in my system, you have a unique advantage in that in that employees can make a substantially more amount of money based on their individual performance and based on how well they do at particular tables. So at best case scenario, our systems are identical in terms of how much money people are making. Except worst case scenario, my system, or best case scenario, excuse me, flip flop those two. Best case scenario, the employees in my system can make more money based on the amount of performance that they actually have. And again, we still have this argument that says tipping allows for an incentive for better performance. And this is something that's generally speaking proven to be true. It's something the studies show to be true. As far as all of your impacts, my one response to most of the impacts that you're going to have is going to be anecdotal versus empirical. Like, you've offered a lot of analysis about racism and sexism. You haven't showed me the systemic problem that exists in how like X amount of people are being treated this way because of X, Y, and Z racist or sexist actions. Like, you haven't showed me that there's this huge problem. You've explained to me how this could potentially happen, and I think you've shown a couple different examples, but I'm clearly going to be outweighing that with the arguments about how it's going to kill the restaurants, which it's empirically proven to do. It's going to make the employees less money, and all it's going to do is going to mask the racism, which is something else that you didn't ever address. Again, we don't solve racism and sexism by concealing it. Okay, we address it by putting a safety net in, which is what I've done to stop people from being discriminated against, and then talking about it.
Removing all the harms of society. I'm fixing the problems with the service industry where people taking tips. Masking the problem really isn't a problem. You say the floor and the ceiling are the same, but they're not, because people are paid as a percentage of the bill, so they can make more money by doing a better job. You say that the restaurants will fail because this one particular chain didn't. I read a particular restaurant, a very famous restaurant, that did very well under the system. Also, Ivar's in Seattle went to a no-tipping system 2 years ago. They're still an institution in the area. They still have lots of employees. They managed to do good business there. You say that they left because they weren't getting paid enough. Well, the answer is pretty simple. Pay them more. and then they won't leave. That's how you keep employees, is you give them a reasonable salary. Maybe they were making a lot of tipping before, and they set a bad gratuity rate. Well, they should fix that. That's just a problem, but it's not inherent in getting rid of tipping. You wanted some more information. Let me read this about harassment from the Restaurant Opportunities Center study in 2014. Tip workers experience higher rates of harassment via media than customers for non-tip workers. Tip workers reported higher rates of inappropriate letters, sex, or texts of a sexual nature from their phones from customers. Tip workers also reported higher rates of harassing physical behaviors from customers, including pressure for dates, suggestive looks, deliberate touching, and inappropriate kissing. Tip workers also experienced higher rates of certain verbal harassment and behaviors from customers, such as sexual teasing or being told to flirt and expose themselves. Customers' behavior towards tip workers are highly sexualized and appear to be generally geared towards obtaining the tipped workers' sexual favors. You talked about exploitation and then that workers aren't heard. But let me read you this. One of my points that I'll extend is on theft from the Huffington Post in 2017. Red Robin restaurants in Pennsylvania forked over $1.3 million because they required servers to share their tips with expediters in the kitchen. Rosarita Mexicano, an upscale Mexican restaurant chain, was recently hit with a nationwide lawsuit by its servers claiming they were required to share tips with floaters, workers who conducted miscellaneous tasks around the restaurant without ever having customer contact. Similarly, the Department of Labor ordered Johnny Rockets to pay 55 servers over $570,000 for requiring servers to pool their tips with cooks and dishwashers. Companies are stealing employees' money. This is not a fair system to pay people. People should be paid a reasonable wage based on their job, like everything else in the world. Used to be that way before the Civil War, but then tipping took over, and businesses were really happy to start to pay $2.13 an hour and then let the customers have to make up the difference. And the result is often employees get screwed over and they do bad taxes. They make bad practices. I'll extend the tax problems of unreported income. I'll extend all the other exploitive arguments about people not knowing when to tip, about theft from customers, about theft from employees. We've still got a ton of reasons on the table why tipping should be abolished.
Okay, so I'll make a couple different responses, arguments about harassment specifically. First thing, that abolishing the tipping system does not do anything to solve for harassment. There's nothing about losing tips. You haven't proven the actual link between why tipping allows for more harassment, and you haven't shown how getting rid of tipping is going to rid the world of sexual harassers and racists. Secondarily, you haven't given me any numbers on how widespread this problem actually is. So you haven't really shown me how impactful it is. You gave one example, but you haven't really shown me how there's a systemic problem. I asked for numbers on how systemic of a problem it was in the last speech, and all you did was give me an example. So sure, we can talk about this, but until we see some real numbers on how big of a problem it is, it's not an issue that we should be voting on because we really are unsure of how big of a deal it actually is. Like, because it happened in one instance, in one scenario, does not mean that we should in fact abolish tipping. You haven't proven, which is your job in this debate round, that it's actually a systemic issue. And so for that, I don't think it's one that people should vote on. There's two worlds at play in this debate round. The first one is your world. In your world, it results in an increase in prices at the restaurant, which hurts the overall business. And as I showed in my empirical study, it causes customers to leave. And this is basic economics. When you have to pay more for something, you're less likely to purchase that thing. Secondarily, it caps the amount of money that waiters can in fact make. On both of our worlds, waiters have a safe floor. However, in your world, that floor is also that ceiling. In my world, however, you have an incentive to work harder and also the ability to make more money. And that's the third argument, that your world disincentivizes individualized service and good service. Specifically, I looked at that one study about how individual service, like with returning customers, people who are regulars at restaurants, removing tipping removes the incentive for people to establish good rapport with the customers that they have. The fourth argument, which you haven't addressed, is that getting rid of tipping doesn't solve racism or sexism. It actually masks it and hides it. This is an argument that I don't think I saw a response to, and you certainly didn't adequately address it. If you want to solve racism and sexism, you don't hide it. You expose it and provide a safety net for those people who could be potentially impacted by it. I've provided the safety net and allow for exposure of that racism and sexism. You just conceal it. The second world is my world. My world solves for all the problems of the affirmative team by guaranteeing that people are paid a fair living wage. It instills in employees an incentive to work harder, which improves the service, and it allows the employees the opportunity to make a lot more money based on tips. It gets rid of discriminatory practices, like people's money being stolen, like racism happening, like sexism happening, by guaranteeing a base floor. These impact that I have proven empirically in an accredited study that was done last year nationwide from an incredible institution like the Center for National Policy Analysis. So at best case scenario, we have my empirical evidence versus your anecdotal ones. I think that my alternative will solve for the problems that you claim, and there's certainly reasons why mine is superior.
Great debating, sir. It's been a pleasure. I'll leave it at that. Like negative have last word, but I'll say it's been a lot of fun, and may the best arguments win.